Good morning, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. We've got about an hour session and then we'll have a little break. I might go a little over the hour. I hope people don't mind if I do that on occasion. I'm notorious for that. My reputation precedes me. Um, but yeah, let's go ahead and start with just a short meditation. As usual, it's just kind of nice to spend a little time in quiet before we begin, and we'll focus on the breath as we did last night. You can use the same technique, focusing on the area around the nostrils where you feel the air coming in and out. Or you can focus on a sensation in the body, on the lower abdomen. This is another point people often use where you feel the rising and falling of the abdomen as you inhale, as you exhale. Or you can just pay attention in general to the breath coming in and going out in a very kind of general way. Whatever it is that you do, just try to stay present with the breath. Whenever you see that the mind has wandered, then gently guide the mind back to the breath. So we'll do this for a few minutes, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to again set our motivation, our intention for the day. So now let's set our motivation, which in a sense is a perspective, as we talked about last night. How are we choosing to look at our lives, the meaning of our lives, why we are here, and even why we are here quite specifically in this moment, this session? As I mentioned last night, there's nothing wrong with starting from a place of self-concern, looking at our own minds, our own lives, wishing to have more peace, more joy. But as we're going to be exploring initially today, we do have to recognize and acknowledge that there are many other beings involved. We are in a interconnectedness with all beings. And so it would be really kind of selfish. That would be a very selfish perspective if we were to simply think about ourselves. When we depend upon so many others, certainly as we saw during the pandemic, without others doing what they were doing, where would our food have come from? Where would the electricity, the power that we needed, the gas for our cars, whatever it is that we depended upon during that time, it was due to the kindness of others. So when we set our motivation, it's within that perspective that we are connected to all beings. And we need to be here with that very wide, expansive heart that thinks about their welfare in addition to our own. Can we work on ourselves? We develop our own qualities so we can be of service, of benefit to others. This is the ideal perspective to bring to our time together. So try to cultivate that in your heart right now. In this way, it's said that what we do becomes a cause for the benefit of all beings. And of course, we're included within that, our own welfare and the welfare of others, intimately connected. Okay, so maybe Isabella, did you want to make an announcement or um,
Thank you. Okay, here we go. Hi, everybody. I just wanted to check in about the Google Drive. I've received a few people speaking to me about not receiving it. So I sent it a week ago, but I think there was an issue with the back end of our system. So I resent it this morning. Everyone should have it. I know Beverly's received it. So you'll have it now. I sent it in a Google Drive link as well as the individual PDFs that you can click on. And then we're also printing out the 8 pillars summary right now. So everyone will have it by the end of class. So if you have any more questions about the worksheets, please let me know and I'm happy to help in any way.
Great, thank you, Isabella.
Thanks, Don.
Okay, good. So again, we were talking last night about the first of these 8 pillars, perspective. Maybe just check in to see if anyone had any thoughts as they kind of worked with that the rest of yesterday, maybe this morning. Any thoughts on what you heard already? Okay. Yeah, please, Chris. Maybe we'll get the microphone. I'm sorry, but we forget about our folks online that need to hear you as well. So sorry, Chris. Thank you.
I did reading last night, and so I
Okay.
realized that I was really on point with my question last night, and that the perspective is the wide focus. And
Uh-huh.
I had sort of missed the point. So
Oh, okay. No worries, no worries.
say that.
No, I was after class. I hope I answered Chris's question
Well,
adequately,
I
but
think I just quite was
uh,
looking at the my definition of perspective and didn't quite get
Okay.
the point made
Yeah.
in the book. So
No worries.
I
Wonderful.
apologize.
Oh, no problem. Don't,
Thank you for your teaching.
no problem. Great. Any other comments? So we still have one more of the three that are introduced in the book. I kind of define them as three. They didn't say first, second, third in the book. They just kind of talked, and I discerned three different perspectives. Again, the first and the third perhaps being a little related and not so distant, but I think there is a bit of a difference in terms of seeing the big picture, which is really, again, hard to do. I mean, my gosh, look at the big picture of climate change. It's huge. Many, many different factors contributing to what we're experiencing in our world right now. It's very hard to hold that kind of view. But nonetheless, I think it is helpful to always look at it and say, what am I missing? What am I not seeing? Because if we see our own little blind spots, then perhaps we can begin to acknowledge that other people are seeing things from their perspective. They've got another part of the elephant that they're holding on to, right? Another thing that I want to throw out there, which is something I've been I haven't read this book yet. I picked it up. It's called Seek, and it's about curiosity. And I think we lack a lot of curiosity in our culture, to be curious about each other, even to really go, what is it that people are thinking? And especially in this time where we are so divided politically in this country, I think we need more curiosity. We need to know what people are thinking on the other side of the fence or whatever side of the fence they're at. Because there are many different ones. We tend to think of only two, but there are many different people in here with perspectives that go beyond a two-party system. And to what degree are we curious about what they think? Or do we tend to just shut it off and say, I know what they think. I know what they are. I know what they believe. Because, of course, the media hammers home a lot of images of what people are like on the other side or on, different than us. And that's not always necessarily true. And when we actually sit down with people, we can discern some pretty amazing things about them. I remember reading a book after the 2016 election, it was actually published in 2016, called Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right. And this was a case of a professor of, I think she's a professor of sociology that's right up in UC Berkeley. Of course, UC Berkeley is kind of the capital of progressive liberal thinking, right? So she decided that she was going to go to Lake Charles County in Louisiana. And over the course of 5 years, spent a lot of time getting to know people down there. Lake Charles County, if you don't know it, is a place where there were a lot of petrochemical plants. And it became known as Cancer Alley because so many people were exposed to so many toxins that were in their environment because these petrochemical companies came in and did their thing and they didn't clean up after themselves very well. They were, kind of taking advantage of the situation from one perspective. Of course, we all benefited from what they did there because we all no doubt used some of the resources they gained, but they did it in a way that caused a lot of damage. And she was very curious. Her name is Arlie Russell Hochschild. And she went down there to see why would people vote against their best self-interest? Because the people they were voting for tended to be people who were against the EPA and all sorts of guidelines that would have been there in place that would have caused the cancer to perhaps not been as prolific as it was. And so she spent time with people. I mean, how many of us are willing to do that? You know, you've got somebody who's living on your street, perhaps. I don't know how often in California. In Santa Fe, I've got somebody down the street that has a political sign out in front of their yard that's different than the person I'm planning to vote for. Will I knock on their door and say, I'd really like to get to know you and understand your vote and why you're voting the way you want to vote, and not be threatened or kind of in that place? I think we need a lot more of that kind of curiosity about each other. Recognize that we don't have the whole picture. We don't really understand everything and everyone else's needs. What was really quite interesting, I'm just going to add a little more on this, and I really should move on to the rest of the material. But one of the things that she found was that there was a perspective in Lake Charles County from many people that everyone that the left tended to favor, people coming in from other countries who were, Afghanis and whatever, people from different places where they were disadvantaged coming into this country, that they were being put to the front of the line. And whereas all of them were kind of waiting in line and watching people being put in front of them. I mean, it's a perspective, it's a way of looking at things that we need to kind of honor and say, yes, perhaps that is going on. And perhaps people are feeling that kind of resentment, that there is a favoring of certain people over them. And that's understandable. We feel the same way sometimes too, right? You know, where we don't want to have other people take our place at the front of the line when we've been waiting so long to get to the front of the line. There's a lot of disadvantage in Lake Charles County as well. I mean, it's not a rich county by any means. This is a very impoverished area of our country. So I think we need to, again, open our eyes to why people are thinking what they're thinking and their perspective so that we gain some appreciation for the fact that ours is not the only one that's kind of valid, if we want to use that word. Yeah, Carol, please. Microphone, sorry. Do we get the microphone too? Yeah.
I appreciate your perspective on going to find out what your neighbor believes. There is a fear what they're
Sure.
and addressing with and maybe media driven how people are going to react if you were just curious, neutral, what they're, there's a fear that's developed.
Yeah.
So thank you.
No, I appreciate that. I talked the other night about fear and working with fear. One thing, I'm going to be doing a talk in San Francisco on Monday, the 21st. That's called Bridging Our Differences. And I've been doing some research on that about what's all out there. And there's actually a wonderful organization, I think has Building Bridges or something like that. They point out the 3 C's. First is curiosity. Second is compassion, which is, of course, what we're going to talk about probably tomorrow, maybe later today. And the third is courage. It does take courage, to have that willingness to go and sit down with somebody. And I was talking to some of my interfaith friends after the 2016 election, and I was saying, I think what we really need is for people to come from different parties and get together and just like have a meal, just sit down with people and get to know who's at the table. Because, and that does take getting past some of our fear that people are going to be threatened by that, or people are going to be accusational and be confrontational. But we have to show some sort, I think each of us as individuals, I'm not saying our side or anything, I don't mean that. I'm saying each of us as individuals has to get past some of that and kind of look our fear in the face and say, okay, well, where is that really coming from? Is it a lot of projection on my own part? Might be some validity to some of it. We're certainly living in very volatile times, but let's go past that perhaps a little bit and just see if we can muster up the courage to sit down with somebody whose views are different than ours and really get to know them. And some of you, I'm sure, have people whose views are very different in your own family. And to what degree are you talking to them about these things and getting to know why they believe what they do, why they feel the way they do? Were you going to say something, Beverly? Yeah, please, we'll get the microphone right there. Yeah.
There actually, I believe it was after the 2016 election.
Mm-hmm.
It was a number of years ago. We live in the Central Valley, and so a neighboring involved with a lifelong learning program at our local college in Stockton. And in Modesto, a neighboring city, they had, I don't think they participated, but they were given a recording of this entire weekend. People from the 2 major parties. And the whole weekend was exploring, and I was able to see, they loaned us the video. It was fascinating. And at the end, they came to the agreement, even though it wasn't the intention of changing anyone's mind, but more of understanding their belief system, how they came about to support their candidate or their party. And at the end, they all agreed they were actually more alike than different.
Yeah.
Which I thought was wonderful.
Gives me goosebumps.
Yeah. They wanted the best for mankind, for our citizens of our nation. Anyway, I wish I could cite my source.
Oh, that's okay.
But I can't. But
sharing it.
I watched that video and it was fascinating.
I'm sure it was. It does sound.
It was clips of the weekend. It wasn't the whole weekend.
Right.
But,
no, and that is one of the things that you pointed out, Beverly, with that it's really important that when we do engage with that type of thing of getting out of our own little silo, our own bubble, that we have that curiosity that isn't about changing the other person, isn't about convincing them that what we think is right and what they think is wrong, because that's just going to set it up. Talk about, fear. This could be the way you're going to make it confrontational because you're going to make it into something that is all about that perspective that you're right, they're wrong. Yeah. Yeah. Mary, please.
I wondered if anyone's heard of the organization Better Angels.
Uh,
That's an organization that brings the Republican and the Democratic parties together
Wonderful.
and tries to find commonality.
Yeah,
And the fact that we actually have more in common than we have difference.
absolutely.
So
Thank
that's
you
something
for
if
pointing.
anyone's interested.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, Mary. There's another organization I came across that's also, I got to write down the name of it. There's so many of them out there. It's kind of heartening to see, that we've got many organizations that see what's going on. They've got their pulse on the fingers of America and what's going on with our citizens and how we are working with, particularly with this election, and they're wanting to do something positive. And again, we can't all necessarily do that, but I'm just throwing it out there as something that if you have the opportunity and if you see maybe there's an opening to even just talk to one person. I've been entertaining this idea of that one person who put the signs out on their yard, and I don't know this person. They're a few doors down on the other side of the street from me, so I don't really get to know them. Actually, in Santa Fe, we don't really tend to know each other all that well. Maybe that's true in most of our country, but I just want to be curious. Have some compassion for them. Maybe even if they didn't use 3 C words, I would say probably the second word should be empathy. We're going to talk a little bit about empathy and compassion when we get to that pillar. But there is a difference between empathy and compassion. And I think it's important to initially have the empathy that really wants to see what it's like in the shoes of the other person, to really see what their pain, what their difficulty is like, what are their concerns? Anyway, I'm going kind of off here a little bit on this subject, but obviously, I need screen sharing. Sorry. It's obviously at the top of mind for most of us, right? We are in the midst of this political season that is very challenging for many, many people, and it's challenging on all sides. Don't think that we're, whatever your point of view is, that you're the only one that's dealing with things that are challenging. Okay, so let's get the slideshow going here from the current slide. Okay, so this is the third of the perspectives, and we've touched on a little bit already by what we've talked about here today, which is, again, on having a perspective beyond oneself to include others, which again is very much a part of our Mahayana Buddhist idea that we really want to think beyond just me, myself, and I. This means that we shift from an individualistic point of view where only our own needs are considered to a more collective one in which the needs of others are taken into account. As I said in the motivation today, during the pandemic, we became aware of the fact that we are not able to be completely self-sufficient, right? You cannot survive without people doing what they're doing. I mean, we all depended upon that during that time in particular when it was, everyone quarantining at home and, not being able to be doing the things that they were doing. This wider perspective also leads us beyond our own self-regard. This is Douglas Abrams saying, self-centeredness is most of our default perspective. In Buddhism, this is identified as kind of one of the main sort of enemies in our own minds. Sometimes refer to it as self-cherishing, but I like self-centeredness, self-importance. We think that we're the center of the universe. I remember when I went to see the Dalai Lama, I actually took my mom to this. My mom passed away earlier this year, and I was glad that I got her to see the Dalai Lama in 1999 in Indianapolis. This was a little public talk he gave before he did the Kala Chakra initiation in Bloomington, Indiana. My father was too ill to go, but I brought my mother. And anyway, the very first thing, Robert Thurman was introducing the Dalai Lama. The very first thing that came out of his mouth was, every one of you thinks that today is all about you. And it's really true. I mean, yeah, you're there to see the Dalai Lama, but you think it's me having this experience, me being here, we think about ourselves pretty constantly. We wake up in the beginning of the day and think, about what we need, what we're going to have, how our day is going to go. Yes, we do have thoughts about others during our day. I'm not denying that. We are certainly not completely selfish. But even our ways of extending to others are very self-centered often. right? Like we tend to extend to the people who, again, are complementary to us, who mirror us, who are close to us. And we don't tend to look at the people who are beyond that. And when there are people who are in our field of awareness who are outside of that range, we tend to be kind of indifferent to what's going on. Well, can we think beyond our own self? Again, we're going to look at this later, as I said, with empathy as well. That's very much about taking the perspective of others. But even at the level of a perspective, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that we have that ability. As it says here, but as the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop demonstrate so powerfully, we also have the ability to take on the perspectives of others, to think about what's going on for them. And of course, we can also learn that, as I was just saying, in terms of being a bit curious. An example of this, and maybe you've heard this before, this is from a quote from someone named Sultan bin Salman Al Saud. He was one of the people at the International Space Station. We had the opportunity to go up and see Earth from that vantage point. And he said the first day or so, we all pointed to our countries, right? You know, as you see the Earth rotating, you go, oh, that's where I'm from, you know. The third or fourth day, we were pointing to our continents. By the fifth day, we were aware of only one Earth. You know, and that's kind of, again, getting this idea that we're all in this together. That was the tagline, the slogan during the pandemic, right? We're all in this together. You know, and that's the perspective that we need to take sometimes. Get out of our own little bubble and think, how are my thoughts, my actions having an effect on others? Can I think about people who are in another part of the world even, and think about the effects that my actions and thoughts are having on them? Again, it's not as direct, certainly, but we are all interconnected. This global world and global economy that we have, that we're so much more aware of than, again, at the time of the Buddha, where everything was really quite insular, can see how connected we are to others and how our actions are having an effect. Can we think of it as one Earth? And there's a really wonderful book that it's kind of off topic a little bit, called Active Hope by Joanna Macy. Maybe many of you have heard of Joanna Macy, a really amazing kind of eco warrior, if you will, environmentalist. She's in her 90s now, and she's still just tireless in trying to get people to become aware of what's going on with our planet. In this book, she talks about the whole shift in consciousness that can happen when we begin to think about things in that way. Again, it's a perspective. She essentially says that, you know, the way to go about what's going on is three different perspectives. One of them is business as usual. And a lot of us have that perspective in maybe even parts of our day. Maybe there are times we break out of that, but just kind of putting the blinders on and going straight ahead and not even caring what's going on. Hopefully we're not that bad all the time, but we do have that occasionally. The second one is this kind of doom and gloom perspective. I forget the word she gave to it exactly, but it's sort of like, it's the end of the world. You know, this is all, and then there's some validity to that perspective, right? Because things are going in a pretty bad direction. But that's not really a helpful perspective to have either, right? The third perspective she calls the great turning, which is the idea that we see that what we are going through as a collective humanity on this planet is a really powerful opportunity for a whole shift in perspective that will become the great turning, our turning of consciousness into a whole different direction. It's been out for over 10 years. They published a kind of revised 10-year edition not too long ago. And when I first read it, I was like, yeah, this needs to happen. And then, of course, it starts with you. It starts with, how are we choosing to be in the world? What sorts of actions are we engaged in that have an awareness of others, have an awareness of the fact that we're not on this planet alone, not just the people, but also, of course, all the animals and the world itself. So again, this is just more examples of these shifts in perspective that I think can be really helpful. As the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop explained, the wider perspective leads to serenity and equanimity. It does not mean we don't have the strength to confront a problem, but we can confront it with creativity and compassion rather than rigidity and reactivity. You know, like this idea, I mean, we just need to kind of take responsibility. We're all here partaking of what this world has to offer and everyone else's efforts. And people are partaking of our efforts and the things that we are doing. Let's see that sort of symbiotic thing and take advantage of that and really live from that place. So I'm just curious, are there other shifts in perspective that you've utilized to your benefit? I'm just going to throw this out there for a few folks to speak to if you'd like to address this question. Yes, please, Aaron.
I can share a most recent example where I had to move my mom road trip from Colorado to California.
Wow.
And it was on the heels of a really painful time for her where she had a divorce. And, we've kept in contact all throughout this time. And I always felt like it was really hard for her to listen to me or for us to have like an open conversation. And so I was kind of dreading this road trip because I felt as though she would just have her own perspective and just continue on that path.
Mm-hmm.
So I felt fixed in my mind that that's how it was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had the road trip and, with help with Buddhist teaching and just, thinking about how to not clench down on thought in a way, I tried to just let it go and enjoy the trip. And I made us, a soundtrack and just really tried to get into it.
Wonderful.
And I noticed that she did still have that kind of rigid mind a little bit, but I noticed when I kind of let go of my those thoughts in that way, that it kind of helped her too. And I think we were able to just be in that space together a little better. Is that kind of a good example of something
that's
like
an
that?
excellent example. Yeah, and it's a bit of that last one, to take ourselves out of our own stuff and our own bubble and our own view, and to really look at it from, okay, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do it with a different perspective, a different way of being with your mother. How wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Yes, please, Marty.
Yeah, I have one. It's just really so simple. And that's that I'm just astounded how wrong my assumptions are all the time. and just that, you can't really give them any credence. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good perspective to have. Kind of think this sort of, sometimes in Buddhism, we talk about beginner's mind, like we always have to go back to that place of saying, whatever I know, maybe to set that aside and just be curious about what I don't know. And yeah, maybe our assumptions aren't correct. Maybe even our knowledge sometimes isn't correct. So thanks for sharing that one. Anyone else? Yeah, please, Lindsay. And then make sure if folks online would like to share, please just put up your little. Oh, I'm sorry, Chris. Okay, please, Chris.
I was thinking if there was an omniscient being in the room right now and they could interact with me and see what was really in my heart, I kind of cringe because I've got the intention of having that higher focus, but I think every day when I go through my world, I'm still really self-centered. And so it brings up to me the idea of trust. I think trust was one of the key things that you have to believe. I mean, if you're going to go out and look for that website that's going to give you the perspective that's unbiased, there's 100 out there that are pretending to be unbiased.
Sure.
And so that for me is a big issue, is how do you have the courage to be the one to trust first?
Right.
So,
That's a hard one. That's a hard one. Thank you for sharing that, Chris, because yeah, I think that can be really challenging. But I also liked your comment, that we do tend to revert to self-centeredness really quite quickly, no matter how much we try to put on that mind, that perspective. It's very easy to go back to that default mode. Yeah. Challenging. Yeah, Lindsay, please.
I was just going to add a quick one, kind of like Marty's, where I also am astounded by how often I make a wrong assumption. If I catch it, who knows how often I'm not catching it. But in the Pema Chodron book on the way of the Bodhisattva, where it includes all the Shantideva verses in it, some of you will know it, some of you may not, but she used this very simple phrase we use a lot, which is to have a fresh take. Remember, I think she said that even in her introduction, it's like her introduction to the whole teaching. But I found so much helpfulness in just like, well, what would be a fresh take here?
Yeah.
And just to try to find just a fresh take rather than whatever my take would have been if I hadn't had that moment
Yeah.
to take a fresh one.
That's great. That's a good phrase to use. Remind us to kind of get out of that silo. What's a fresh take? Anyone else? Anyone again online that wanted to share anything? So I think there are a lot when we begin to think about it and kind of investigate and see how we can shift things and how are we looking at things? What is our perspective? I do have a couple of exercises. Maybe I might even have one more question here that I threw on. We may have already kind of touched on it. Was there a time in life when changing your perspective to help you deal with a challenging situation? This is kind of similar to the other one. Let's just go forward and again, was there anything anyone else wanted to share on that? Okay, then let's look at some concluding thoughts. This is from the book. When we take the perspective of others, we can empathize with them. One starts to see the interdependence that envelops us all. Something, again, I've already touched on a lot this morning, even, which reveals that how we treat others is ultimately how we treat ourselves. If it was happening instantly, if like the way that we were treating somebody, it immediately came back to us and we saw what it's like to be on the receiving end of our garbage, we'd get it right away. But sometimes we don't, there's a delay, and so we don't think about it. But we do have to have that kind of consciousness that the way we are treating others is affecting ourselves and is a way of treating ourselves poorly. If we're going to be, saying negative things about them, confronting them, what have you. Rather, we should be treating others with kindness. And then, of course, some sense of humility, which is the next one. And this is where we're segueing into. We are also able to recognize that we do not control all aspects of any situation. Guess what, folks? This is another perspective, right? We don't control everything. We don't have control over, in the end, I think we have control over very little, but we have the illusion that we have control over a lot, or maybe the delusion that we have that. So this leads to a greater sense of humility, humor, and acceptance, the three remaining pillars of the mind. And we're going to move on to humility, which again is very kind of important in conjunction with this. So again, the practice suggestions are on the sheet with a little more words, but essentially the first one was to try Thupten Jinpa's experiment of trying to see the good that came out of something bad that happened to you. These are labels, right? Good and bad, but we're talking about things that were upsetting, difficult for you. And then maybe something good came out of it, right? And then when a difficulty arises, choose one or more of the shifts in perspective to try out, even one that you may have heard here or that you have used yourself that isn't necessarily these three. But take note of what happens internally when you do this. This is the whole point, is that we're not looking at what happens outside. I mean, there may be some effects outside. If we start looking at things from the vantage point of other people and thinking about them, well, maybe the people who are in our lives will actually start seeing that and responding to that. But that's not the goal. The goal is to change ourselves. What happens inside. And of course, where's the joy in that? There should be some joy in us being able to let go of so many of these perspectives that have kept us in our narrow little world and not allowed us to open to that more vast, expansive way of looking at our lives and the other beings that we're involved with in this thing we call life. So again, there's a little more fleshing out of these, but these are the two main. I again didn't put it on there, but you could also use that 5-year flashback idea. If what you're going through right now in this particular situation, scenario might be a difficulty, might be a challenge, but in 5 years, what will that look like? And what could you do now that maybe will shift things a bit so that in 5 years you may look back on that perhaps more favorably? It wasn't quite such a challenge, perhaps it was an opportunity. Here's my little cartoon for humility. Humility isn't thinking less of yourself. And in that panel, it's got no one likes me, I'm not worthy, everyone's better than me. This is not what we mean by humility. It's thinking of yourself less. And the idea here is helping others, being a benefit to others, thinking that we're of service to others. So there is a real differentiation that we're going to get into around what humility is and isn't, because I think when we hear the words being humble, humility, that we tend to revert to that kind of thing of, oh, you want me to be the rug that everybody's stepping on. You want me to be just kind of in this lowly position that is just miserable to be in. This is a source of joy. Humility is not a source of despair and, dejection. It's a source of joy. So let's take a look at that and see. Whoops, clicked on the wrong thing there. The Dalai Lama and the Archbishop were both insistent that humility is essential to any possibility of joy. When we have a wider perspective, we have a natural understanding of our place in the great sweep of all that was, is, and will be. It does kind of follow, right? If we see ourselves in that wider perspective, well, then it's not all about us, right? And it's not all about me thinking, I'm the best thing on the planet and what have you, and the prideful mind that comes from that. It's about recognizing the humility that is just built into the system. We are a part of something that is so much greater than us, right? This naturally leads to humility and the recognition that as human beings, we can't solve everything or control all aspects of our lives. We need others. As I said, that was a key learning. If we didn't get that from the pandemic, I don't know where else we will get it, seriously, because as I was sitting there at home, doing what I needed to do, I couldn't help but think about especially all the frontline workers and people that were continuing to do all the things that absolutely needed to be done and that we were dependent upon. And how wonderful that they were able to step up to the plate, their own courage and determination, and do that. The Archbishop has poignantly said that our vulnerabilities, our frailties, and our limitations are a reminder that we need one another. We are not created for independence or self-sufficiency, but for interdependence and mutual support. It's just a fact of humanity that you can't live completely self-sufficiently on your own. Well, maybe there was that example with Tom Hanks in that movie where he was on the island by himself, and but I think he was still dependent upon the world around him and the things that he needed in order to continue to sustain his life. But it's extremely difficult to be completely isolated in that way. The Dalai Lama was saying that we are all born and all die in the same way. And at these moments, particularly when we come into the world and when we go out of the world, we are totally dependent on others. Whether we are a Dalai Lama or a beggar, whether we are an archbishop or a refugee, our situation is fundamentally the same. And there's a really wonderful meditation that's done in Buddhism, but it can be done anywhere, that I mentioned even briefly last night, just like me, that we think about others and we think they're just like me. Kind of brings ourselves down to some degree and recognizes that there's nothing that special about us. But again, I'm not trying to deny the things that we do bring to the table. Every one of us does have our own unique skills and abilities and contributions. We're not denying that when we have humility. We're just saying, and it's not all about us. It's about others as well. We can think about them and think about their needs. Think that we are really here to be of service to others. I found it quite touching when I first became a little more involved in the organization, FPMT, that this center is a part of, from the vantage point of taking on a more formal role. I think I started as a spiritual program coordinator at our center in Santa Fe and became the resident teacher shortly after. But essentially, and that was again due to the education I had. It wasn't just that becoming an SPC makes you a teacher. Don't get me wrong on that. But the idea is I looked at the FPMT handbook, which they had in writing then. It's all online now, everything that's available. The very first words in it was Lama Zopa, our teacher, saying that the FPMT exists to be of service to others. Again, that's a perspective too, but it's a sense of humility, right? That we are here to serve others. And that really should be every being's perspective to some degree in this world. We are here to serve others through what we do, through how we contribute to society, through the things we do with our job or our volunteer activities or whatever it is that we do. And maybe it's even just serving the people who are in our immediate circle, aging parents or ill children or whatever the case might be, whoever it is that calls upon us needing service, that is our role, to step up to the plate and say, I'm here to serve. Well, I'm really touched again in my interfaith work at how so many religious organizations, spiritual organizations have put in place many formal ways of being of service that Buddhism is lagging it, behind to some degree. His Holiness the Dalai Lama even admits this. He says, so many of these other traditions have things in place that are just phenomenal to help people who are impoverished, who need education and what have you. We have some projects, don't get me wrong. It's not like we're just sitting there and not doing anything. But I think we have a long ways to go. we tend to think we're of service by providing the Dharma, but I think we need to think also of the more immediate needs of people. People do need things day in and day out, and it's wonderful to be involved in that. And humility is key to doing that well. If we do it with a prideful mind, oh, look at me, I'm being of service to others and how great I am, well, that gets us, again, kind of self-defeating. So, with the keen insight of a longtime friend and collaborator, Daniel Goleman characterized the Dalai Lama's attitude toward life. The Dalai Lama seems amused by everything that is going on around him, taking pleasure in whatever is going on, but not taking anything too personally, not worrying or taking offense at anything that is happening. He kind of has a bit of resilience that is a part of his humility. That, I don't think he cares one iota if when people come to greet him in Dharamsala, they get a meeting with him, if they show respect or if they just, are callous to him. He doesn't care. I mean, he really is just comfortable in his own humility, comfortable in his own stance. What the Dalai Lama was reminding us throughout the week, not to get caught up in roles. And indeed, arrogance is the confusion between our temporary roles and our fundamental identity. There's a lot in that sentence. Arrogance often comes from, once more, how we inflate some sense of who we are in the world. That's just our temporary role. I mean, it's just the role that we are playing. And sometimes it's even for just a short while in this life that we play that role. But our fundamental identity, who are we at our deepest core, our deepest essence? As I was saying last night, we can trust that there's something kind of good and pure and connected at that deeper level. It's just a matter of staying in touch with that and not getting caught up in our roles and identities that, are kind of put on top of all that. I'm just going to touch on a few of the aspects of humility that are discussed in the book. I don't always discuss everything, but the main ones that I think are important. What is genuine humility? I've talked about this a little bit, seeing its relationship to joy. Because again, I think that's a little hard sometimes. How is me being humble related to my joy? Also knowing its opposite, spending a little time talking about pride or arrogance, and then avoiding self-denigration when practicing humility. This is one of the dangers, is that, again, we can easily fall into, especially in our Western culture, becoming the doormat, becoming the person who's just feeling really horrible about themselves because that humility is kind of caved in. It hasn't really been sustained at a good level. So there's a Tibetan prayer the Dalai Lama said, which is a part of the mind training teachings. This is the second time already that this phrase mind training or lojong has come up. A Tibetan master says, this is a Geshe Langri Tangpa, whenever I see someone, may I never feel superior. From the depths of my heart, may I be able to really appreciate the other person in front of me. This is a kind of a softer way of putting it. On the next screen, I'm going to show you the way that it's often translated, which makes our ego kind of blanch a little bit. But the idea here is that this is one of the 8 verses. By the way, we have the LMB here. There's the 8 verses trail. If you get time, you can go up and go around that. It doesn't really take too long, and there's little benches to stop at each of these 8 verses. This is actually the second of the 8 verses. And this is the idea that when we see others, that our initial thought should be humility. Our initial thought should not be all about ourselves, but really appreciate the other person in front of us. Here's the wording that is sometimes used: when in the company of others, I shall always consider myself the lowest of all, and from the depths of my heart hold others dear and supreme. So that phrase, the lowest of all, is one of those things that can lead us to maybe that feeling of self-denigration of like, again, I'm the dirt under their shoes or whatever. That's not the meaning of that. The meaning of that is that I want to see myself not from that elevated place of pride and who I am and whatever. I want to see myself from the vantage point of looking at everyone else as being more important than myself, as having some value that I need to acknowledge and appreciate. Because we spend plenty of time feeding ourselves that other side of it. We do vacillate between self-hatred and denigration and self-importance and self-centeredness. And these two are very much related. I remember when His Holiness the Dalai Lama had an audience with Western teachers way back in the early days. I was not involved in Buddhism at all even then. And I think this was in the 80s. He was meeting with teachers like Sharon Salzberg and Venerable Thupten Chodron and all these amazing teachers. And I think it was Sharon Salzberg who raised her hand and said, Your Holiness, We have so many students in the West who have self-hatred. Can you give us some advice about how to work with that? And His Holiness had a really hard time getting this concept, like self-hatred. What do you mean? People don't hate themselves. They cherish themselves. They are too self-centered. They love themselves too much in a sense, and so he had a real hard time with this. And he said that these are actually the two same minds. It's just the one gets inverted on itself, where we think we're so important that we kind of start getting mired in our own self-hatred, that it becomes, to some degree, we would say even some forms of depression revolve around that. I'm not a clinical psychologist or anything. I don't know enough about depression and all the ins and outs of it. And certainly there are many cases where it's not all about that thought. But many people get sad and depressed in their lives because they take that self-centeredness and they put it inside in a very kind of upside down way to where they feel horrible about themselves. It's a shame, but it's all revolving around the same sense of me being the most important. Anyway, His Holiness's observation, I don't know whether he holds water for all of you as well, but I think there's something to be said for, again, this trickiness of reading a verse like this and then suddenly thinking that, oh, this is, Buddhism asking me to be kind of, again, in this lowest position that is just miserable. Once more, humility is meant to be a source of joy. If we are with others from that perspective, we will take a genuine interest in them. We will see them through that lens. Again, a lens of, as I said earlier, curiosity, just kind of being with them and wanting to know more about them and how to serve them, how to be a benefit to them. It's kind of interesting. I didn't know this. Never took Latin when I was in high school, but the word for humility comes from the word humus, meaning earth or soil. Humility literally brings us back down to earth, sometimes with a thud. We sometimes are humbled in kind of unusual ways, right? I don't know if anyone wants to share a story along those lines. Maybe it's too embarrassing. But it is nice. It's good to be humbled occasionally, to just kind of like go, oh wow, yeah, okay, sorry. Maybe it's a bit of too when our assumptions aren't really quite held up, and then we have to be in that place of really going, oh wow, I have to back down because I made the wrong assumption. I did something that was not in line with how things actually are. I want to share a little bit about what Brene Brown in her book Atlas of the Heart, fairly recent book on emotions. Talks about humility there and what it is in terms of it being more genuine. Humility is openness to new learning, combined with a balanced and accurate assessment of our contributions, including our strengths, imperfections, and opportunities for growth. I really like this description because I think once more it's an openness. Again, humility isn't about shutting down and being in this, oh, poor me, whatever. It's about being open to look at others to say, what do you have to teach me? What is it that I can learn from you? How is it that I can, again, be a benefit to you, connect with you? Because I'm in this world with you. And there's opportunities for growth within that. She goes on to say what humility isn't. It's not downplaying yourself or your accomplishments, which according to researchers is modesty, not humility. It's also not low self-esteem or meekness or letting people walk all over you. Again, things I've already said, many of these, but it's not downplaying ourselves at all. The emotion of humility involves understanding our contributions in context in relation to both the contributions of others and our own place in the universe. There's nothing wrong with being kind of, again, we use this word pride sometimes in a variety of ways. Sometimes we think of it in Buddhism as really kind of a delusion, as not a good state of mind, but that's when it becomes quite distorted. But a healthy sense of pride or self-confidence is important in our world and in our living in this world, to really acknowledge the contributions that we make to whatever it is that we do, that we experience with those in our immediate circle and what have you, in the world at large. There's nothing wrong with that. It can sometimes, when we go into that place of acknowledging our own contribution, become prideful in a diluted way. But there's nothing wrong with that part, because once more, that's part of the interdependence. It's not to say that we're dependent upon the whole world and we do nothing and just benefit from it all. We also contribute to the world. The things that we do make a difference. And if it wasn't for everybody kind of doing what they do, we wouldn't have the world and the life that we have. How wonderful. It's once more very much rooted in the concept of interdependence. No news there in some regard. Buddhism is very much embracing this concept of interdependence. And I think once more, other spiritual traditions and even science embraces interdependence, right? To understand that we're not isolated and alone, that we are involved intimately with others and day-to-day activities in our world, what have you. It's impossible once more to be completely independent. It just doesn't exist. On the relationship of humility to cultivating joy, can you explain the role that humility plays in cultivating joy? This is Douglas Abrams asking, and the Archbishop apparently started laughing even before he finished the question. And as it says here, he went on to tell the story of a bishop who exhibited false modesty. And also the author, related a joke about, that the Archbishop often tells. Well, I'm going to share these. I mean, many of you have the book in front of you. You could just go to the book, but I've got my Kindle up here. Whoops, I don't want to do that yet. Let me do my screen share and then pull up the Kindle. And I'll read this. I think it's just, they're kind of funny. I found them funny. I don't know. Sometimes when I read them, people don't really laugh, but we're going to talk about humor soon. They tell the story of a bishop, he began, who was about to ordain candidates to the priesthood. They were speaking about virtues, including the virtue of humility. And one of the candidates came up to the bishop and said, "My lord, I've been looking in the library to find a book on humility." The bishop said, "Oh, yes, I've written the best book on the subject." So do you really want to read a book on humility by somebody who thinks they wrote the best book on the subject? And I chuckle at that one. And then he says, I thought that the Archbishop might also share the joke he often tells of the three bishops. These three religious leaders were standing before the altar, beating their breasts with great humility, saying how before God they were nothing. Shortly, one of the lowly acolytes in the church approached and started to beat his chest, professing that he too was nothing. When the three bishops heard him, one elbowed the other and said, "Look who thinks he's nothing." I don't know. So again, it's kind of hard to talk about one's humility because it becomes the opposite of humility. I remember not putting anyone down here either, but there was a student who, when he first came into the studies over in Italy, my perspective on him was that he was trying to be the humblest person there. And it became a little bit kind of counterproductive from my perspective. I mean, and I don't know his mind. I don't know everything that was going on for him, but it was like always this opinion or this way of standing of like opening the door for everybody and letting everybody absolutely go through, but where he himself went through and doing all these things that just showed this sense of, and again, I could have misinterpreted everything that he did, and it's my own projection. But it felt a little like that to me. And I think we have to be careful again that we don't boast about our humility. It's just the counterproductive. But I think there's some element of joy in that when we actually kind of can look at ourselves from that lens and say, okay, I'm just doing my best to be humble here. And I don't have to like make it into a contest. Being humble is not a contest. So these stories about false modesty are funny because humility isn't something you can claim to have, right? It is for this reason that I think that the Archbishop was laughing about the question even before he'd finished asking it. So there's some joy, I suppose, underneath the surface there, but nonetheless, he and the Dalai Lama were saying that humility is essential to a life of joy. And it's exactly this humility that allows these two men to be so approachable, so connected to others, so effective in their work in the world. I think this is where the joy really comes in, is that when we are in a place of humility, then in a sense, it's like people don't feel threatened by us. People don't feel like we're competing with them. People don't feel like we're judging them. I haven't talked about judging. Judging is a really heinous sort of pattern that we get into mentally of always looking at others. That's what our prideful mind is often doing, kind of looking down on others, seeing others through that lens. If we are humble, then there's kind of a joyful place that we're coming from that people will feel natural in connecting to us, which is wonderful. That's why, again, His Holiness, everywhere he goes, all these, big, brutish kind of security people that just melt in his presence because they feel that it is exuded from him. He's just radiating that. So again, it's a little tougher, I think, to get. I think from perspective, all of these of the mind, in my estimation, other than humor, which of course we know naturally brings some joy, I think it's a little bit harder to work with them to see kind of the joy that's underneath there. But this is essential to joy. You know, we can be in a much more joyful place if we aren't always looking at others through that lens. We'll get to that in a moment when we talk about pride right here. None of us are immune to the all too human traits of pride or ego, but true arrogance really comes from insecurity. Needing to feel that we are bigger than others comes from a nagging fear that we are smaller. I like that. I mean, I don't know that I thought about pride before I read this in that lens. But, you know, we inflate ourselves because we actually kind of fear that we're smaller than that. We have to kind of, maybe there's animals in the world that do this, right? That puff themselves up to look bigger so that the creatures that are out to eat them don't eat them because they'll appear so much bigger. You know, we tend to do that because we fear that we're actually quite smaller. Have this sort of, again, insecurity. I'm going to point out that there are three types of pride. There are actually seven of them. I'm not going into all seven. When Buddhism teaches on pride and what's called this course, Minds and Mental Factors, it's a really wonderful course on like Buddhist psychology, kind of getting to know, as Venerable Rabina, one of my dear teachers, she says, get to know all your crazy roommates, you know, like who's all hanging out with you in your mind there. You know, so this course, I mean, it also goes into more functional aspects of the mind, but pride is one of our crazy roommates. You know, pride is one of those that kind of takes over the party sometimes. And, you know, you go, hey, get out, you know, or we should get it out. But pride in these first three, it shows how our pride can become extremely distorted. The first one is this puffing up of the mind, thinking that we're superior to lower persons, right? That's kind of natural, right? When we see people who's whatever criterion we're using to judge them in terms of whether they dress well or they have a education or they're whatever. I mean, you can have many different criteria for doing that, right? We assess that they are lower than us and we feel superior to them. Excessive pride is where we see that those who are equal to us, but we still think we're superior in some way. You know, they're actually our peers, but we're going to hold a superior view. Well, the third one is pride beyond pride, a puffing up of the mind, thinking that one is greatly superior, even to persons who are actually superior to oneself. You know, that's like so distorted, right? You know, oh, Dalai Lama's got nothing on me, right? You know, that would be ridiculous, right? To think that we're somehow better than these amazing people or people who've shown certain qualities. So pride has a lot of different aspects to it, and it is a distortion. The one thing I want to point out, because we're talking using these words of like superior and inferior and what have you, is that, of course, one of the underminings of pride is that we can see that we're often blind to that person that we're feeling superior to. Our superiority is based on, again, the criteria that we are choosing to compare ourselves to, and that may not be the full picture of that person in front of us. Yeah. Even when we deal with people who are evidently in a more disenfranchised place, such as those who are unhoused and what have you, we can look at them and say, I don't know this person, and they may have amazing qualities. Some people who are unhoused have degrees that go beyond my education, you know, and have done things in their life that are way beyond. And I will take a short break soon. I know I said I'd go just a little bit over, but they're going to change the batteries. So what was I talking about? Oh, the criteria, right. And so when you're looking at others through that lens of feeling superior and having a prideful mind, you aren't seeing who they are. And they might have, again, amazing qualities. Let's go forward to just kind of finish off this section on pride, at least before we have a little break. Yeah, let me finish off this then. Maybe go to 10:15. Is that okay? And we give 45 minutes for people. Is that all right? So many people, the Dalai Lama said, seem to struggle with being kind to themselves. This is really sad. You see, if you don't have genuine love and kindness toward yourself, how can you extend these to others? Again, this is the idea that we tend to put ourselves down a lot, particularly in this culture that I mentioned earlier, that His Holiness was kind of surprised to hear. But if we don't care and love for ourselves and have genuine compassion even for ourselves, how can we extend that to others? This is why in the Buddhist path, we begin with ourselves, looking at our own situation, and then we can translate that to how we are seeing others. Is this working okay? It feels a little strange. I'm hearing things differently than I was before. So we must remind people, as the Archbishop has said, that basic human nature is good, is positive. I was so heartened to hear this from the Archbishop because, again, my experience growing up Catholic was I didn't get that. I was absent again that day. Somehow I didn't get the message that my basic human nature was good. When I came to Buddhism, I was really encouraged to see that that's the perspective. But here the Archbishop is saying that this is his belief. This is how he looks at humanity, his perspective. So this can give us some courage and self-confidence. As we said, too much focus on yourself leads to fear, insecurity, and anxiety. Okay. Now, we should also realize that the recognition of our own limitations and weaknesses can be very positive. This can be wisdom. If you realize that you are inadequate in some way, then you develop effort. If you think everything is fine and I'm okay just as I am, then you will not try to develop further. So, again, we do have that kind of tension between looking at ourselves and not putting ourselves down, but also we have to recognize where we do have deficiencies. And every one of us, maybe you're all Buddhists, I don't know. Sometimes use that line when I'm teaching people because we don't know who's a Buddha in this world or who's a much more enlightened person than we are. Again, we don't have any cognizance of those qualities. But nonetheless, um, we, we probably have stuff we need to work on. So we need to be sort of aware of that. Let me hand this over to Okay, we're back with the other microphone. Okay, so once more, I think that this is something we have to recognize is that having kind of denying our pride and what have you, we can acknowledge our good qualities, but then we also, on the other side, have to acknowledge the deficiencies, the things that we need to work on. And we won't make any spiritual progress or even any progress in anything unless we can look at how do I improve? How do I actually develop deeper qualities that will be worthwhile in the long run? There's a Tibetan saying that wisdom is like rainwater, both gather in the low places. I've often heard it from the vantage point of like, you don't want to be like the mountaintops in Tibet that are barren because they're way above the tree line. Rather, you want to be like the valley down below that gets all the water, right? So on the mountaintops, yeah, the water starts there as ice, but it becomes this fertile source of growth in the valleys. So that's the idea behind this. And there's another saying that when the spring bloom comes, where does it start? Does it start on the hilltops or down in the valleys first? Growth begins first in the low places. So this is a way to look at it as well, is that it's really, again, to our advantage to be humble. It sounds strange. I'm not trying to, again, reinflate this sense of self and what have you. But when we are in a humble place, when we are able to look at others through that lens and be of service to them, this is the greatest gift we can give to ourselves. This is the best way to treat ourselves because then we look at others and do learn from them. There's that wonderful phrase. Maybe I'll bring it in later. I think I've got it on my computer here. I could look it up. I think it's from Khalil Gibran and the Prophet, where he says, "I have learned da 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 from so and so." Anyway, I'll share it later. But we have to be even grateful for the fact that we can learn from so many others if we're in a humble place. If we actually look at them as someone who has something to share with us, something to teach us. So similarly, if we remain humble, then there is the possibility to keep learning. So I often tell people that although I'm 80 years old, I still consider myself a student. Again, I think this was the Dalai Lama. Well, maybe it's the Archbishop talking. I can't remember who it was, but they were both in their 80s, I think, at that time. And again, this is to make ourselves into that view, that we're always a student, always learning. It's one of the problems of being a teacher sometimes is you start to lose that perspective and you think you're the one with the knowledge, but you could be humbled pretty quickly by many people who come to teachings and have things to share that you don't know, that, I'm learning a lot every time I teach. So that's an important reminder. We should always see ourselves as being able to look at others from that perspective. So what are your experiences with seeing humility in yourself or others? Anything anyone want to share? Again, in these sharings, don't share something you feel uncomfortable sharing. It's not to put you on the spot, but if there's something that comes to mind in our discussion of humility here, you know, seeing it in yourself, seeing it in others, because sometimes seeing it in others is good too, because it reflects it back to us and says, wow, I want to be like that. But anyway, yeah, Lindsay, please.
I learned of a teaching. It comes from Ravi. What a vague, like so many Ravis in the world. But more specifically, it comes from a book called The Words of My Perfect Teacher. And the teaching is about just noticing when you're thinking about yourself at all. Like you're conceptualizing a self, you're wondering about yourself. These could be on a continuum from outright selfishness to just a sort of self preoccupation, which is what I liked about the cartoon, because it just showed all this space showing what it looks like when you're thinking about yourself. So you're not making yourself low in the modesty way. You're just, it's just a lot of space spent conceptualizing the self. So, so the Ravi thing was he had white stones and black stones. And every time he genuinely saw himself thinking of like others first, like caught himself doing it, he'd put a little white stone in the jar. And every time he caught himself just thinking about self, just in all the ways we think about ourselves, many natural ways, of course, he would put a black stone in. And in the larger book, it talks about lots of practice of catching it that way. And at first, it being a lot of black stones, and then it being a little bit of more black and white stones, and then eventually more white stones. So, in all honesty, with me, I find it's still a total mix. I may have had some days where I'm genuinely finding myself thinking about how to benefit others as my first instinct. But truthfully, I catch myself just conceptualizing out of my own point of view, like the most still, it's just such a natural thing that we do. But just having that, such a simple little thing, I have them on my desk because I do a lot of Zoom calls for work, and just clearing it out every day and starting fresh.
Good for you.
It just made this such a concrete practice for me in case anyone else finds it helpful to hear about it.
Maybe we need to develop an app for that. The White Rock, Black Rock app. No, I've heard of this practice and heard the story, but yeah, I've never heard anyone who actually did it. Congratulations. That's wonderful. I bow at your feet. Yeah, the actual visual. And there's something kinesthetic about it too. And many people learn kinesthetically by actually objects and things that they can hold and work with and what have you. But I think it's really a wonderful practice because again, we don't recognize how often we're reverting to that, and just that is our default mode. So thank you for sharing that. That's great.
I'm definitely
Mary.
getting white and black stones when I get home. Oh, that's even more special. I have a difficult time balancing self-care and self-love with selflessness. And I was wondering if you could speak to that, because in a way, my concept of a balanced life would be having a mix. So if you have equal amounts of black and white in your jar, you're probably experiencing less suffering than most people. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, Mary, because again, we're never about denying ourselves completely. That would be the extreme, right? Where we just we don't care, we don't put food in our body, we don't do anything to care for ourselves. I guess it all comes down to what are the thoughts that are accompanying that self-care? Why do we care for ourselves? When I look at somebody like Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who was our spiritual director, I mentioned his name earlier. He passed away about a year and a half, not quite 2 years ago now. But he was the example for so many people of this sort of selfless way of being. And there were times where it was almost like he was denying taking care of himself, but people would certainly make sure that he had what he needed to keep doing what he was doing. And he would even acknowledge that at times that, yeah, okay, I need to sit down and have a meal or do whatever, get some rest. But I think it is this, I don't know, kind of a continuum. So, when you talk about being at a place where the rocks are even, that's a wonderful place to be because most of us are probably in the black rocks, being the majority of what our day is, thinking about me, what do I need? What are my kind of immediate things versus being focused on others. And we can even do that just by our thoughts. It's not like every one of us has a profession or an opportunity where we are with others throughout our entire day being of service to them. But nonetheless, how often do we think of others? How often do we even bring a motivation like we do for these classes of thinking that I'm going to work on myself, but for the benefit of others? So when we get to self-care, I think it's part of that too, of like when I'm taking care of myself, I'd like to get a massage I used to like to get it once a month, and then my massage therapist passed away some years ago. And I've been going to a new place and it's really expensive. So I decided once every like 6 to 8 weeks is what I can manage. But when I go there, I try to have thoughts of like, why am I doing this? Yeah, I mean, it's enjoyable. There's pleasure in having my body get all the knots taken out and what have you. And that sensation that occurs, that pleasure, the joy that comes from the pleasure of being touched in that way. But why am I doing it? So I think that when we get down to these places of where we say, self-care, self-compassion, taking care of ourselves, and that old adage, I think, is absolutely true. If we don't take care of ourselves, how can we take care of others? But that's going to be our motivation then. Well, why do I take care of myself? Why do I tend to myself? Why do I become focused on my needs so that I can take care of others? So then it becomes a little different. It shifts those activities into more of an other-oriented activity than a self-oriented activity, so that we no longer are just caught up in me, 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 me all day. By the way, there's a wonderful video out there called, I think I mentioned this the other night, but Mipam Rinpoche, called What About Me? Maybe I'll even play it for you here. It's part of the weekend. It's a jazzy little song. It's kind of fun. But this is like our thought from the time we get up till the time we go to bed. What about me? What about me? What about my needs? If we think, well, yes, I'm going to feed this body and I'm going to exercise this body and I'm going to get this body massaged and I'm going to do all the things that I need to keep this body going and tend to myself in these healthy ways. Why? So I can be of service to others, so I can benefit others. So in the end, my life has meaning and purpose and isn't just about hedonistic pleasure, you know? So I think, again, when we get into this sort of rock exercise, some of those rocks become white by virtue of bringing that mindset to what we're doing. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche was really keen. Sorry, I'm going over my 10:15. I said, see, I told you my reputation precedes me. So Lama Zopa Rinpoche used to even teach on how we could bring a motivation to even mundane things that we do that aren't even necessarily self-care. Like, when you go to the bathroom, every one of us goes to the bathroom several times a day, right? We're expelling substances. You can think of, through what I'm doing here and expelling these impurities in my own body, may other beings have all the impurities of their mind removed. And what a wonderful thought, right? To think, may everyone be free of their jealousy and their hatred and their anger and that's like transforming your going to the bathroom into a spiritual practice. How powerful. I mean, so we can transform the other activities that we do, into amazing practices, right? Yeah. Mary said, I forever changed her bathroom habits. That's good. Lama Zopa changed mine when he brought that. But once more, I mean, those are times that are maybe a little more neutral in our lives. Maybe we don't have kind of crazy minds going on. We just do these things. They're rote activities that just go by without doing anything. Another one he has is like turning on a light switch. How often do we turn on a light switch every day? Turn on the lights. Think that you're enlightening all beings. Think that you're bringing light and joy to the minds of all beings. I mean, wonderful practices that you can do. There's a whole little pamphlet, and maybe I'll share the address of that if you want to interested in that, called Cultivating Bodhicitta Mindfulness. It's like everything that you do is about transforming even these mundane, ordinary activities into something very powerful. let's take a little break again till about 11 o'clock. Got about roughly 40 minutes to get some fresh air, get some refreshment, go to the bathroom. To go to the bathroom, be sure to do the thoughts. Turn on some lights, do whatever you need to do. And again, we'll reconvene. So again, have a productive break in terms of thinking about what we're talking about here, and then we'll conclude humility when we come back. Okay, just a reminder from Carol here that downstairs it's open in the kitchen area. Those of you who are staying here, are the folks that are coming in, it's open for them as well to go down there, yes?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, good. And if you need the code for the kitchen?
The code should be 7748.
84, isn't it?
Oh, yes. Yes, 7784. Yeah.
That's what I used this morning or last night. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So again, you're welcome to go get tea,
Oh,
refreshment, whatever you need. All right.
and the same for the compa.
Okay.
If it ends up being locked, 7784.